First of all, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of myself and the ESG Working Group and Minviro, we're very excited today to be discussing the findings of our ESG Working Group's most recent report on ESG in the UK lithium sector. I'm going to start off with some acknowledgements and some introductory remarks before we launch into some of the more concrete findings and recommendations of the report. So I'll kick it off first with an introduction first, some acknowledgements, because unfortunately Robert, who was the chair of our ESG working group in 2024, is not able to join us today, but he was the one who pioneered this project, who identified the need for a case study into looking at what a integrated domestic supply chain would look like. And he was able to bring together a lot of great minds in the working group to push forward this project, including Adriana, who I worked very closely with on co-authoring this paper, who's also unavailable today, but is really the brilliant mind behind a lot of these findings. So a big shout out to both of them before we start. I'll hand it over to Jordan first to give a brief introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. My name is Jordan, and I'm the head of research and development at Minviro. As mentioned, I really cannot take credit for any of the content within this report. It really was a lot of Adriana's hard work and a lot of Rob's kind of coordination, but I'm hoping that today I can do a good job of explaining our perspective on the report, why we think it's important, and going through some of the findings. Minviro, we are a lifecycle assessment company. We've been around for, I don't know, six years now, and most of our work in the early days was focused on raw materials and looking at the environmental impacts of raw materials. And in particular, lithium was one of the sectors that we started our work at, and most of our early projects were actually lithium projects. So we've known the importance of ESG surrounding lithium for a long time. We've been members of CMA since the inception, so it's not new. It's not new information or new stuff that we're talking about. But I think with the landscape we're looking at now in the industry, this report is very timely. We're seeing a lot of regulations. We're seeing a lot of international changes to the way that supply chains are working. All the while, the battery sector is continuing to innovate and things are changing. Battery chemistries are changing, battery configurations are changing. So it's very dynamic, even though the message is very similar. And just a sort of three major aspects from the report, just very quickly before we go into details, that from an industry perspective, even though Minviro is not an industrial company, we don't make lithium or make batteries, we work with the people who are doing that day to day. There's three things that I see this report as being very important for guiding. The first one is sort of encouraging people within the sector to look at their processes with an environmental, social, and governance lens from the get-go. No longer is it the case that you can mine, create your projects, create your products, manufacture things, and then look retrospectively at how you've affected the environment and society. It has to be coupled with the engineering processes when you're actually working out your processes and how you're going to do things. You should be considering these things at that time as being inbuilt into a lot of modern companies, and it's no longer, do as much damage to the environment as you want and then put some grass over the mine. That the days for that are very different now, and the report details ways in which you can do so using LCA, but also other techniques. The second aspect would be related to this is the regulatory landscape is changing very fast. The battery sector in particular, there's European regulations which are in force. Everything is kind of coming into play in the next couple of years in terms of battery passports, carbon footprinting being mandatory for these sectors. And from our perspective at Minviro, this is just the start. The battery sector is the one which is having the most stringent and advanced regulations now, but there's a lot more things coming online. So Critical Raw Materials Act, the eco-design principles, these affect other commodities, other metals, other products to do the same. So it's no longer, again, something you do retrospectively and something that's nice to do. you have to get behind this if you want your company to be successful, and there's a lot of support from governments and bodies. And lastly, it's just strategic. So thinking about ESG within the lithium sector and beyond has to be part of strategy now. Investors will not invest in projects which aren't sustainable now. If it's a really sort of money-making machine, that's great. But if you're going to be hit with carbon tax later on, which means you can't sell your product, the sustainability is within the strategy. So from an industrial aspect, these three things I mentioned actually all go hand in hand, and being ahead of the game with ESG and LCA and other sort of carbon footprinting and things really ticks all those boxes from the get-go. So the perspective from Minviro is to be proactive, use the guidance within this report as a foundation for how the UK interacts with the supply chain beyond the country. But also, like kind of this is a case study for lithium and the lithium sector, but the principles we're talking about today can really extend to anything. And I think we are seeing a very positive shift in most countries towards this sort of thing. So it's very timely. So it's really great that Eileen and the team put this report together at this time, because time is perfect in my perspective. But hopefully that's a bit of an introduction from our side. I can hand over to our colleagues and I can dive into a bit more of the environmental aspects later in the webinar.
Perfect. Thanks, Jordan. I'll now hand it over to Fiona as well to give a brief overview of some of the other more global ESG trends that we're seeing.
Thanks very much, Eileen. So I'm Fiona Cessford. I'm from SRK Consulting. We work almost exclusively at the upstream end of the supply chain, but what we're seeing more and more is interest from downstream the supply chain affecting that upstream. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ESG, sustainability, and kind of where we're seeing some of the global trends at the moment. So depending on who you talk to at the moment, ESG, or environment, social governance, may be either an absolute strategic imperative, as Jordan has been speaking about, or it could be a dirty word. There are perceptions of greenwashing in certain areas. And when we talk to colleagues and to peers in the industry, it's clear that things are a little bit muddy at the moment. If you search the internet on ESG controversies, you are going to find multiple people opining on the term ESG and what it means. Most of this is linked to the financial industry, but there's also confusion over terms such as ESG, sustainability, and the words are often used interchangeably, and they're defined differently depending on which company, which country, or even which individual you speak to. And if we go back in time and we look at the ever-increasing focus that there has been on sustainable development since the 1990 Rio Declaration and even before, more recently, there's been this exponential rise in this concept of ESG. And this has been driven in part by the financial sector's focus on the global need to address climate change. And Jordan touched on this as well. You know, if you think about things like the Principles of Responsible Investment Organization and its signatories, they manage $120 trillion worth of assets. And they're the ones that are trying to drive this focus on ESG, starting over actually 20 years ago now. So not as recent as we think, but really it's been very apparent in just the more recent sort of 5 to 10 year period. As you're going to hear later, ESG is not just about climate change. It covers a huge remit of topics, and those are applicable to both our industry and the supply chain within the UK, but also our global interactions where we might be getting commodities coming in or exporting our manufactured goods. And further information kind of on the approach to ESG as used by the Critical Minerals Association ESG Working Group can be found in the report. But I'm going to just start with a little bit of a high-level summary of what we mean when we talk about ESG and how that differs from sustainability. The UK's Institute of Directors explains that the concept of sustainability is a holistic approach for long-term value or capital creation. And it's basically those policies and strategies that a company chooses to align with. And in terms of the UK's lithium value chain, or in fact, any critical mineral value chain, the sustainability value can be in terms of what we may call capitals. Depending on which academic paper you refer to, you might have 5 capitals, 4 capitals, or 6 capitals. I'm going with the 6 capital route. So I'm going to start with natural capital, and that's basically the mineral resource that's in the ground, but it's also the environment that hosts the resource or the environment that hosts the downstream manufacturing companies. It's the human capital. It's the people working at those companies all the way along the supply chain. It's the social and relationship capital, and that's the stakeholders that could be affected by the projects. But it's also potentially the people who might eventually be purchasing the final end manufactured good. There's manufactured capital, and that's the processing of raw materials all the way through to consumer merchandise. Intellectual capital is with our universities and our training institutions who are responsible for innovation, capacity building, and research. And it's also about that on-the-job learning that happens in these companies within the UK, and it recognizes SRK's global reputation for very highly skilled people. And lastly, and probably the most obvious one, it's financial capital. It's whether we're talking about money in shareholders' pockets or whether it's taxes to the government, which we all have to pay. There's value creation at all of these different levels. ESG, on the other hand, is defined by the Institute of Directors as a standardized risk management and implementation framework. It basically enables organizations and their stakeholders to understand and measure the impacts on those sustainability factors that we've talked about. It also helps with evaluating the effectiveness of the corporate governance that's in place. So in basic terms, it's about the practical implementation of measures that a company does to ensure it performs in a way that their sustainability objectives are being met. However, we live in a very dynamic world at the moment, and there are changing attitudes specifically to the term ESG. There's many reasons for this. Probably one of the first and foremost is the socio-political posturing, particularly in the USA. There are perceptions of woke capitalism in certain areas. Some companies are finding it difficult to implement ESG performance. It's not easy. And there may be lack of capacity and things like that that affect that difficulty. There are perceptions by consumers that if it's green, it's expensive. That isn't always the case, but that's the perception. And then lastly, and particularly affecting the financial sector, there's a lack of standardization and transparency on rating metrics, and that can affect decision-making. Now, luckily, in the UK and further afield in Europe, there is recognition that just because it may be hard doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. There's new policies, there's regulations to help support and define approaches, but there's still a way to go before we can fully understand what all of this means to the companies on the ground that need to show compliance. And this is where organizations such as Minviro, SRK, and many of the other members of the CMA are trying to find that direction. In the end, whatever term we use to explain what we're doing, it's just semantics. Meanings change with time and public perceptions. New terminology arises to reflect nuances in interpretation. And then these are twisted by others unless these terms are explicitly defined in guidelines, standards, or law. Ultimately, the need to protect our water resources, conserve flora and fauna, and prevent harm to our community does not change. Now we just have these new words of water stewardship, nature positive, and social responsibility. By embedding these considerations into business decision-making, companies can mitigate risks and they can identify new opportunities and contribute positively to society and the environment. So, regardless of whether you take a sustainability-driven value approach or an ESG-driven risk management approach, there is a need for the UK companies, investors, government, and academia to work together to maximize our ability to achieve a socially just transition while implementing robust environmental stewardship. And all of this needs to be done under a transparent corporate investment and regulatory governance framework. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what we call it, we just need to do it.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for such a comprehensive overview of the ESG landscape. Moving forward, I think as well, we'll move on to Noah. We are so honored to have Noah on the call today, who wrote a forward of support for this report. Noah is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Critical Minerals, which ourselves at the CMA UK work together closely with. We frequently host meetings at Parliament that discuss issues that are pertinent to critical mineral supply chains, especially addressing risk and disruptions in supply chains and how we can address that in the UK. So I'll hand it over to Noah to say a few words of welcome.
Thanks, Eileen, and thank you to Fiona for that very comprehensive view of where we are philosophically as well with ESG, because there's been a lot of challenges to the sector, to the profession, and a lot of chop and change, I think, in how we apply it to different industries. Certainly something I saw myself in my financial career prior to Parliament. But I'm now, as Eileen said, very honoured to be leading the Critical Minerals All-Party Parliamentary Group here in Westminster. And indeed, this report from Minviro is really, really timely for us, given that the government is currently working, I hope, to put the final details towards the industrial strategy and the critical minerals sectoral component of that. So I really welcome the report, and I'm grateful to the work that Minviro, the CMA, and others have done contributing to this. I'm also happy to see a continued supply chain focused framing. It's really important that we reflect that in everything we do, also in the APPG, and I'm calling on the government to ensure that we have a very practical supply chain and unblocking focused approach with our critical minerals strategy, one that really looks to break down the barriers at every individual level. And we often talk about upstream, midstream, and downstream. So we have structured our APPG discussions, which you're all welcome to join at various points. We're looking to lock in the next day soon to discuss, I think, circularity. But we've also had dedicated industry sessions on upstream, midstream, and downstream industries, because it's really important that we engage hand in glove with the industry, with technical experts, and in particular with ESG experts, given that so many of the blockers that we see are ESG blockers. And I think some of those blockers are writ large in this supply chain for lithium, particularly in the midstream, where there has been a real sort of, whilst we've got very positive assets in our upstream production, and we're starting to make a real concerted effort in downstream production of batteries, for example, there's still a real missing piece when it comes to the midstream in this industry subsector, and particularly when it comes to the production of cathode active material, which is a subsection of the industry not immune to ESG challenges, as we've seen in other countries that are looking to produce more cathode active material in Europe, whether that be Finland or Germany, and we've been trying to sort of get a bit more excitement in the potential for producing this critical material in the UK. But I think from trying that firsthand, it's easier said than done, even when you've got government and government MPs showing a real interest in pushing that industry forward. There's got to be that social license to operate, and there's got to be a clear pathway forward on navigating some of those ESG risks that come with the very, I guess, chemically intensive and actually, as we've seen, very carbon intensive from the report, parts of the production value chain. So I'm really glad that the report shines a light on some of the opportunities that we have to do things differently and better by building a sustainable domestic supply chain. And I will continue to work with the CMA, with the parliamentary group here, and directly with the government, who we're lucky to have visiting our primary production sites in Cornwall tomorrow, to try and continue this supply chain from end to end. There are a lot of missing pieces, but I think the report speaks really well to some of the crucial ESG challenges in that picture. And I'm once again, I'm just really grateful for the work that's been done on this, and look forward to engaging with it to point us forward to solve some of these blocking challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah, and we're very pleased to be working with you as chair of the APPG Critical Minerals. We've had some amazing conversations so far, and looking forward to the next meeting as well. Great. So now that we've gotten these introductions, let's dive straight into more of the purpose of the paper and the findings. I think Jordan and Noah and Fiona have given quite a great introduction to the policy and legislative context of and strategic context of this paper, but a little bit more in the UK specifically. We've seen a lot of legislation that's come out in the past 2 years that are very relevant to critical minerals. We've seen 2 critical mineral strategies, well, 1 strategy and 1 refresh, and we're expecting DBT to be publishing their updated critical mineral strategy very soon. We also had the updated criticality assessment come from the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre based out of the British Geological Survey. That came out in December. And the big change there was an update to the methodology, obviously, which changed the amount of critical minerals on the list from 18 to 34, so quite an increase. Lithium was included on both lists, both times. We also have the industrial strategy, Invest 2035, and an upcoming one as well, where we're anticipated to see that critical minerals will be in that strategy classified as a foundational sector. So acknowledging the critical and foundational role that minerals play in the UK's industrial sort of green revolution, because obviously the energy transition is an industrial one. Some other things to include as well. I mean, Jordan, you gave a nice overview as well of the EU battery regulation. We've also got the Critical Raw Materials Act that's coming into play, and considering that the EU is one of our largest trade partners, and hopefully one that we'll be exporting to in the future. It's also very important that we align on legislation and ESG standards to make sure that we reduce those trade barriers. Our goal for this paper was very much to identify horizontal policy levers. This is a phrase that Noah uses in our APPG meetings. Basically, policy levers that will allow us to unlock value across the entire supply chain. Issues such as energy and financing and innovation, which is what our report has really tried to lock in on. So our goals and our hope is that the findings and recommendations of this paper will help inform policymakers on how to address the barriers that prevent development and yeah, how to overcome them. That's the purpose of the paper from more of a legislative side from the CMA's point of view, but I'll hand it over to Jordan as well to provide a bit of perspective on the purpose of the paper from more of an industry and ESG community perspective.
Sure thing, thank you. So I kind of introduced in my intro the three branches of why I see this as being important, which was understanding the processes from the start with a sustainable lens when you're designing supply chains, adhering to regulations and embracing regulations, but also more of a strategic kind of personal um, like impetus for these businesses and sort of adding a differentiator for them to be ahead of the curve. Going into these a bit more detail, as I mentioned, engineering goes hand in hand with understanding the impacts that you have on the environment, first of all. I'm going to talk about the environment aspect of ESG mostly here, but as you'll see later on, a lot of the risks and opportunities related to the environment have direct repercussions for society and the governance side of things. So it is all quite intimately related. But if we take the example of LCA being used within a ESG landscape to understand the lithium sector, if you have multiple players, each with their own process, their own energy consumptions, their own chemicals that they're using, their own specifics going on at each facility, every single activity going on there will have environmental repercussions, social repercussions, and governance repercussions. And using tools proactively within this design phase of supply chains is the way to ensure that all of it is harmonized and that there's no sort of nasty surprises in terms of the ESG implications later down the line. So what I mean by this is using a tool like lifecycle assessment, you will know to make 1 kilo of lithium carbonate, you will know all of the things that you've consumed, all the implications for your supply chain, and you have this information ahead of time so you can make your strategy around ways to reduce your impacts. The purpose of this paper is not to get people to measure things and then that's the end of the journey. The environmental analysis that goes on behind the scenes for these kind of things should be the starting point, and that's what we talk about a lot in Minviro. That an LCA doesn't mean you've ticked the box and you move on with your life and everything's good for the environment. It gives you the base information for you to then look at a sustainable future. So in 5, 10, 15 years, what does the LCA look like? What does the supply chain look like? And how can you actually enact changes to make things better? And this paper looks to condense a lot of that information about understanding the process on a kind of engineering level and coupling this with the ESG analysis. And we also spoke a little bit about the regulatory and strategic motivations behind this paper. Regulations isn't really a strategy. People have to do them. And it's good that the EU is kind of setting expectations with this battery regulation framework, which is likely to be adopted in other circumstances. So Eileen mentioned the Critical Raw Materials Act. It looks very likely that the framework set up for the battery regulations will be very similar for critical raw materials. And that's going to affect not just lithium, but all aspects of the supply chain for all different materials, for all different kinds of products. But I guess regulations, the reason that they're there is just as was mentioned by Fiona, you need this kind of further backing by governments and this strength to kind of establish what's the standard and what is the norm so that people can adhere to it and then do good from that point in time. Unfortunately, people aren't going to just be sustainable for the good of their heart. There has to be a business sense. It has to be wrapped into the finances and the economics within a country or the company itself. It has to be this win-win situation in all circumstances. But it's good now that they aren't decoupled. Like financial success cannot be separate to being responsible. So I think the paper also condenses why the regulations back up a lot of this decision making. And the final aspect for the purpose from us is the UK, as we know, has limited natural resources compared to countries like Canada, China, Australia. There's a lot of mines there. There's a lot of capabilities for them to make very domestic supply chains. The UK is in quite a unique position in terms of our ability to play a part in these really important technology supply chains, but perhaps not be the ones creating lots and lots of primary resources. We've got amazing resources in Cornwall, which are being explored with really novel opportunities to make them sustainable and economically attractive for global supply chains. As Eileen mentioned, our relationship with the EU and the batteries that are being made there is super important. But the UK has the ability to strategically be ahead of the curve and offer the most sustainable lithium, the most novel technologies, and the most attractive upstream options and midstream options for the downstream players. So the time is of the essence. Again, we're riding this wave of lithium ion battery. I wouldn't say mania. That's going a bit far, but EVs and batteries are kind of at the forefront of all these discussions within ESG and sustainable futures. But things like solar panels, motors, wind turbines, hydrogen technology, there's a lot of other tech within the decarbonisation lens, but batteries seem to be the most advanced, and that's what everyone has their attention on. So the UK is sitting here with this really unique opportunity to be a sustainable supplier of lithium to the forefront of decarbonisation activities. So as a third point, the purpose of the paper is to explain this to people and kind of show how the UK is positioned within this global market and assist kind of efforts in different sectors. So the finance parts, the engineering parts, the innovation parts, and uniting everyone within this effort to make the UK a sustainable, innovative player. So yeah, that was a bit of a ramble, but hopefully it kind of puts the position where I see it from the industrial side.
Perfect. Thank you, Jordan. So yeah, let's jump into exploring the UK lithium sector. Briefly, also want to expound why we chose lithium as a case study for our paper. Obviously, there are 34 critical minerals on the UK critical minerals list. We chose lithium for multiple reasons. Firstly, the UK hosts lithium resources. There are companies such as Cornish Lithium, British Lithium, Weardale Lithium, and Northern Lithium that are exploring and developing projects to extract lithium from hard rock and geothermal brines. These deposits, we'll talk about it later, they're not as extensive, obviously, as those found in countries like Australia or Chile, but they can still provide a considerable domestic source of lithium, helping to enhance the UK's energy security and supply the growth of domestic industries identified in the industrial strategy, such as EV manufacturing, for example. There's also a very rich research and innovation landscape in the UK that's pioneering technologies to extract and process and recycle lithium in cost-efficient and low-impact ways. One of the most promising being direct lithium extraction technology. And the UK is home to some of the world's leading universities and research centres on the recycling of lithium-ion batteries as well, and other electronic waste components. So this paper, Jordan and I are now going to identify some of the developing and operational UK lithium projects in 5 specific stages of the integrated supply chain. We're going to look at extraction, processing of lithium intermediates, manufacturing of cathode active materials, production of lithium-ion batteries, and recycling of lithium-ion batteries. We've put together a map of some of the developing projects here in the UK. This was made in August, so it's actually already a little bit out of date. It's a little snapshot in time, obviously, but one big sort of omission from that map would be the announcement of AESC's gigafactory up in Sunderland, which was visited by Minister Jones. I believe it was a week or 2 ago now. But it's still a helpful map to look at some of the projects that we've got here in the UK. It's such a rapidly evolving landscape, so it's very hard to find a map that will be up to date once it's things tend to go out of date as soon as they're published. So yeah, Jordan, shall we dive right in?
Sure. Someone's mentioned in the chat about Altillium as well. That's quite a recent, very quick development that's happened. So
yes, absolutely, and a very important part of the supply chain as well, cathode active materials. Great. Jordan, I'll let you give a little spotlight on LCAs first before we jump into the key life cycle stages.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, this report is not an LCA report. LCA is a component that we've used to discuss the risks and opportunities in the supply chain. I'm sure a lot of people in the webinar are familiar with LCA, may use LCA, but I think it's worth just going over it really quickly so that when Eileen and me are discussing specific aspects of what we've looked at, nothing is muddy. So life cycle assessment is simply just a methodology that is used to quantify environmental impacts, and the word quantify is the kind of main feature here. It is data, it's numbers based, it is scientifically backed. So it's also been developed alongside different ISO standards. So at Minviro, we use 14040 and 14044, which is for the conducting of the actual calculations, and 14067, which is like communicating the results of the carbon footprints. It's globally used. It's been around for a while. I think Coca-Cola were the first people to use it in an industrial setting, but it is the technique that is named in the EU regulations to use for carbon footprints and other analysis, and it's looking likely that this is going to continue. It's very prominent in the construction sector, which is a few years ahead of us in terms of ESG compliance. I mean raw material sector. But yeah, like that, this is what we do at Minviro. This is our bread and butter of our service offering to the customers we work with. And it's nice to talk about lithium in this context because LCA is product-based. Fiona gave an amazing overview of the broader sense of corporate sustainability, but when we're talking about LCA, this is product level. So lithium product, it's a good case study to use. The other benefit of LCA is that it is not a carbon footprinting tool. Carbon footprint is one of the impact categories that is covered under the climate change potential impact category. But there's 16 other impact categories included in the methodology recommended by the EU, which includes things like water use, land use, acidification, eutrophication. There's a bunch of different ones. And the technique, you don't need to do anything special to get this analysis. LCA will give you a suite of data to look at the complete environmental impact of your products. And as I mentioned, this is very environmental based, but a lot of the outcomes can imply changes within the social and government sectors too. The reason we do LCAs and the reason they've become so prominent is because, yeah, they are becoming standardized and it's written in regulations that this is the kind of optimum technique to use. But on a more soft sense, it allows people to position themselves within the market. So if you are a lithium-ion battery manufacturer and you use LCA to quantify the total environmental impact of your supply chain, it's then very easy to see how you're doing on environmental terms against competitors and within the landscape. These techniques are standardized for that reason, so that you can compare between different studies as long as the methodology is consistent. But also, as I said at the start, LCA is not the end of the journey, and it certainly isn't the end within this report talking about lithium. We've provided some data and you've got numbers. Okay, great, your impact is 20 kilos of CO2 per kilowatt hour. What next? How do you bring that down? What changes do you need to implement to make that 15 or 10 or 5 or 0 perhaps? It really is a sort of framework for the future as well. It's not just a snapshot in time. And we found that companies who are ahead of the game in terms of using LCA in the planning phase can make really effective decisions based on data and science-backed methodologies for the future of their product. So their net zero targets and their decarbonisation targets can be informed by LCA. So that's why it's so important. And this little diagram on the side just explains how it works. You really just look at all the processes and all the consumptions within your whole supply chain, and this is translated into a final life cycle impact for your product. And then when I mean consumptions, I'm talking about raw materials and energy. I think that's a good enough overview. So if we're talking about the impacts and different data points that we're using in the report, this is the backing of what we're talking about. So if we move on to the risks and opportunities for the UK, as Eileen mentioned, we've got 5 stages here, and I'm going to handle the risks on a broader sense that we have been informed by LCA studies from Minviro and beyond, and Eileen will come in to talk about the implications for the UK in particular here. So if we start at the very start of the supply chain, extraction of lithium and with lithium intermediates, the risks here obviously are going to be related to mining and extraction activities, and the direct life cycle impact of blasting stuff, moving stuff, using lots of water to process, electricity to process. All these things will have environmental impacts within the life cycle assessment study. The most obvious one, and the one that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, is carbon footprint. But as I mentioned, water, land use, acidification can all be contained in here. So, for example, if you're consuming explosives to get your lithium out of a hard rock source, that explosive has chemicals in it which had to be made in a factory. There's going to be direct emissions of CO2 during the process. All of this gets wrapped up into the life cycle assessment calculation, and the risk for extraction here really is how much fuel are you using to get a kilo of ore out, what electricity are you using tons of water to process it. This is the big risk, and this is why LC is really important, because it itemizes this. But also for resource use, more broadly speaking, how difficult is the ore to get out of the ground? You'll see these amazing maps that exploration geologists and mining geologists make of their deposits with all the blocks and all the stopes that are going to take out in sequence. One block varies to the next block. One might be really tough to extract. There might be a lot of waste rock in there. There might be lots of valuable things that you really want to make sure you get. All of these things will have implications into how much energy is consumed to get that rock out of the ground. And again, knock-on implications for the life cycle assessment. So challenging ore bodies or lots of kind of issues within the actual physical extraction of the rock have direct consequences for environmental impacts. It's kind of an obvious one, but it's one that is at the forefront of this upstream kind of risk matrix. And one of the most important ones, particularly for lithium, as everyone on this call probably knows, is how the perception of mining is actually translated to communities in nearby areas. It's no surprise that a lot of mining activities, particularly prospective ones, create a lot of controversy. A lot of communities are unsure what this will mean for their lifestyles, for their health, for their job prospects. There's a lot of different factors that are in this. So maintaining positive relations, particularly in the mining stage, is hugely, hugely important to the lithium sector. We see challenges in the Chilean lithium extraction to do with how water is being consumed and used within communities, and like how does this affect people who need that water to live if gallons and gallons are used to process the lithium and extract it. There's a lot of challenges there, and there's a lot of moving parts and things that have to be considered and how the people in the vicinity of your project react to the extraction. It's easy enough to say there's industry in the area generating money, great. But if people can't use their water, if people are kind of moved out of jobs because of a lot of overseas experts coming in to run the mine, that's not going to look good. So you can't just be profitable and sustainable. You also have to have the backing of the community. And there's lots of things that extractive industry can do to be positive for the environment. Just because there's a mine there doesn't mean it has to be a bad thing. Without proper considerations, it could be a bad thing, but there are a lot of companies who are investing a lot of time and energy to really interact with communities and make sure that the risks are minimal for those who are proximal to projects. So that's in a broad sense, and I can pass over to Eileen to talk about how the UK feeds into these.
Great, thanks, Jordan. So we identified 3 major opportunities for the UK to lead in responsible practices when it comes to lithium extraction. The first one is that we have a unique opportunity here in the UK because of the island's distinctive deposit types. So we have lithium-rich geothermal brines in regions like Cornwall and County Durham, which makes the UK distinct from most of the operational lithium operations. There's already a lot of evidence, both academic and feasibility studies, that have shown that DLE possesses higher efficiency than traditional methods, lower energy consumption, and other benefits, such as being, integrated into existing geothermal projects, for example. So that is one way that the UK can push forward, pioneering a different way to extract a lithium, and that is low impact, low water usage. Secondly is powering projects with renewable energy. The UK obviously sort of is one of the leaders in the world for greening their grid. And while direct supply of renewable energy to extraction sites may not always be feasible, the rapid expansion of offshore wind farms will be key to increasing the share of renewable energy in the UK grid. We were very pleased that it was a couple of weeks ago now that UK government announced 300 million through Great British Energy for funding the domestic development of offshore wind supply chains. That will definitely play into it. But this will help the UK to reduce the carbon footprint of its lithium extraction projects, allowing the UK to push on the global market an alternative product. And thirdly, an opportunity we've identified is we see a lot of projects that are actually located in economically deprived regions in the UK that would really benefit from the local job creation. Obviously, extraction of lithium and other critical minerals requires high-skilled jobs. Infrastructure development and economic growth would bring economic growth. Second part of the supply chain, I'll hand it back to Jordan.
Sure. So moving one step down, we've got the lithium chemicals out the ground. Now we need to make them into something useful to put into batteries. So the first risk, which is from my perspective, usually the one that people don't like to talk about very much, is waste. It's not a very cool or sexy or trendy thing to talk about, but it's a huge, huge consideration, particularly for our industry and particularly for the battery supply chain. So byproducts made during the process have to be taken into account. So if you're making these kind of refined lithium chemicals, which are really pure in the state that you want them so that they'll be really effective within a battery, there's lots of chemicals and waste that you've had to have got ridden of during the process to get to that point. A lot of these can be really hazardous, depending on the ore type. There could be a lot of waste with some kind of nasty chemicals in them, things which could dissolve over time if just left in tailings. Also, with lithium, potentially ore bodies that have radioactive implications. So mining your product and then just chucking all the waste in the pile is really not good enough. There has to be proper considerations with a temporal element too about what's going to happen to this waste. The optimal here is that you can reuse the waste in something. So there's a huge, huge discussion about sodium sulfate, for example, within the battery sector, which is made in huge amounts when you're doing all the different processing stages to get your battery. This is something which doesn't have like amazing economic use, but there's a lot of focus on how this can be reduced or recycled or put back into processes somewhere. But it's a huge risk. And again, thinking about the social implications, having piles of radioactive waste next to your facility, even just visually doesn't look good. People are going to be unsettled by that. So if there has to be a concrete waste disposal plan in place for these kind of industries. And also, whilst you're getting to this point of having really pure lithium products or nickel or graphite or anything you're doing, this, from our experience in Minviro, tends to be the most energy intensive part of raw material to decarbonisation product supply chains. So this is true for silicon going into solar panels, it's true for graphite going into anodes, and it's definitely true for lithium being made into high purity chemicals for batteries. You need to consume a lot of energy to make sure all the impurities are gone. And if this is in a location where you're using lots of fossil fuels, the life cycle impact is going to be pretty huge. So the risk, I guess, is just the huge amount of energy that is needed to do these processes, and having no plan in place about what kind of energy you're using to do this can be very dangerous. I think you can look towards the example of some of the challenging nickel deposits in Indonesia, which need a lot of energy to process. This is a big question mark for the battery sector as well, beyond lithium. And lastly, kind of related to those, is engaging with the community to make sure that the implications of your chemical processing and your waste dealing doesn't reach people, nature, water resources, the implication of not dealing with the two top points here have direct consequences for the third one. And yeah, you don't really want radioactive ore going into water streams and things like that. So having really good public engagement, different cross-sectoral engagement to make sure that the waste is really effectively dealt with and doesn't even become something that the public have to think about is optimal, and don't need to explain why that's a huge risk if this is not done. So for the UK.
Yes, so following on from extraction, another opportunity, first one we highlighted was once again powering projects with renewable energy. Obviously, the midstream is a very energy intensive part of the supply chain, so making sure that we make use of the renewable energy power of the UK is critical. The second is based off of a recent report published by the Department of Business and Trade, which was written by Fraser Nash, the CMA, and the Materials Processing Institute on critical mineral midstream and recycling capabilities. It emphasizes this significant opportunity for the UK to become a midstream and circular economy powerhouse. So the specific ESG opportunity for the UK here lies in embedding responsible practices and enhancing the circular economy through closed loop systems for waste and energy management. And this is really where the UK's advanced research and development landscape can come in, to help develop those closed loop systems for lithium processing, such as recycling waste products and byproducts within the supply chain, to help reduce environmental impact and to contribute to overall resource efficiency and the advancement of the circular economy. The final opportunity we highlighted, this goes more into the strategic opportunity for the UK, but onshoring lithium midstream operations, which Noah did touch upon in his introduction about how important it is. It would reduce reliance on foreign supply, as China currently accounts for around 60% of global lithium ion battery production. And Chinese dominance over the global lithium supply chain also poses a risk to the UK battery market, as it determines the spot price of lithium carbon equivalent. So by establishing domestic refining capabilities, the UK can enhance supply chain resilience, mitigate geopolitical risks, and secure an alternative lithium supply for its growing industrial sectors. This would help position the UK also as an alternative responsible provider of a midstream service, which would attract international investment and hopefully beneficial trade partnerships as well. Third, cathode active materials.
This is feeling very good cop, bad cop with me doing the big risks and you being like, oh, here's what we're going to do. Anyway, happy to fill that role. Okay, so for the CAM, this is probably where, from my perspective, the data part of the LCA becomes really important. Within the European regulations, CAM manufacturing has to be fully primary data from manufacturing. Every single bit of energy, every chemical used has to be directly from the company's data sources. That kind of paints a picture about why this is such an important stage. There's a lot of complicated chemical reactions going on here, a lot of quite damaging chemicals being used to make this really high-performing CAM. So this is really, although the energy-intensive part of the midstream is a huge focus, this CAM part is also really important. So yeah, energy-intensive processes, calcination can occur at thousands of degrees to make things really pure. And this, of course, has implications for greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of things being dissolved to make CAM. There's a lot of things being heated up at really high temperatures to make CAM. So looking back at the life cycle assessment diagram with the raw materials and energy consumed, you can see where this is going. If you're not on top of this in terms of what you're consuming to make your product, this could be a huge hotspot. And given this primary data need for the battery regulations, the downstream equipment manufacturers need to understand this very, very well. So there's a huge amount of pressure on CAM manufacturers to really be very transparent about what's going on at this stage. You can also imagine that metals like cobalt and nickel going into CAM. So one of the most popular CAM chemistries is nickel, cobalt, manganese, and NMC or NCM. And yeah, cobalt supply chain infamous for its upstream social impacts, and nickel is becoming quite infamous for its upstream environmental impacts as well as social. So even just the mention of these metals within makeups carries a lot of weight. People already want to know where the cobalt was coming from, what are the social conditions upstream there, how is the nickel made, what's happened to the environment in the surrounding area to get that nickel to be high purity. And it's actually sort of driven a bit of a resurgence in non-nickel based CAM. This isn't a recent thing, but in the last like 5 or 10 years, everything looked like it was going towards NMC, but LFP has been kind of emerged as an alternative simply because people can say there's no cobalt in it, for example. That is a good, is looked upon very favorably by the downstream, but the performance is better for cobalt and nickel containing batteries. So you can kind of see how businesses still need to use them, still want to use them. So they have to be able to deal with the implications on ESG terms here. And just in general, again, these CAM facilities can be quite complicated. They can have a lot of dangerous processes going on to make the materials. So thinking about the employees who are involved, the harmful emissions that they may be exposed to whilst they're making CAM, but also same story with the upstream. What's happening to the community around about these facilities? Are they engaged in the kind of employment of the of the facility? Is the waste becoming a problem for them? The same story kind of applies to each step, but particularly these chemical processing facilities with lots of kind of harmful processing, harmful wastes emitting. There's a special reason to keep an eye on the community and make sure that they're engaged and make sure they benefit from things and aren't damaged by them. Everything is about making positives from these processes. So you really need to make sure the community sees those benefits and sees why it's a good thing and sees the efforts that people are making to get on top of ESG.
Great. So onto UK opportunities. First, and a big one, is that the UK is home to world-leading universities and research institutions specializing in material science and engineering. These institutions can and are and should continue to collaborate closely with industry to develop CAM with higher energy densities, longer life cycles, and improved safety profiles. There's also potential to drive innovation in next generation cathode chemistries, such as high nickel or cobalt-free alternatives, which could reduce both costs and environmental impacts. As someone very kindly in the chat said as well, our report also recognizes that there's only currently one company in the UK producing CAM for lithium-ion batteries, and that's Austell Clean Technology, based in Devon, which is developing green processing technologies and scaling recycling infrastructure to supply the market with low carbon battery materials. And this is very important to note because without CAM production in the UK, it will be impossible to realize and host a fully integrated lithium supply chain. There are also opportunities in the UK to promote collaboration between the midstream and recycling industries on recycled offtake agreement, and as well as the previous two life cycles, also increasing share of renewable energy, because there are some very energy intensive processes in this part of the supply chain. Great. Next, we're on to the downstream.
Sure. I sound like I'm repeating myself lots, but as I said, there is consistency in how life cycle assessment looks at the supply chains. Energy intensive processes, again, are part of battery manufacturing. But actually the interesting thing here is that the discrepancy between green energy manufacturing facilities and fossil fuel consuming battery manufacturing facilities is huge in terms of life cycle impact, especially looking at carbon footprint. So the opportunities here are really high for companies who can make their battery using lots of green energy, but the kind of penalties for companies who don't can be very significant. Things like mixing, coating, and drying all use a lot of energy to do. So I think we released a paper a few years ago about LCAs for batteries in general, and you can just see the difference this makes by simply changing the types of electricity. So huge risk for companies who aren't on top of the energy they're consuming to make their batteries. And there's a lot of safety issues with the battery manufacturing process. The electrolyte going into the battery goes at the very, very end of the process, which is kind of counterintuitive to how you would think a battery would be made up in layers. But this is because there's so many hazardous implications and safety implications of putting this electrolyte in. A lot of explosive opportunities for things to explode in the battery, and also everything being done in a very dry condition. If there's moisture around, there can be lots of kind of different safety implications for the batteries. So this is something that has to be really, really tight within manufacturing facilities, because you can see one of the big criticisms of EVs and batteries in general is their tendency to explode when the conditions aren't right. So companies don't have a choice but to get behind the safety measures within this side. And this extends to employees and community health once again.
Great. UK opportunities. So obviously the UK is not a world leader in lithium-ion battery manufacturing. Firms like China and the US and South Korea dominate the market. However, there are some key ways that the UK can strengthen its own domestic industry. The first one obviously lies in not just our renewable energy infrastructure, but also there's a huge chance here to develop a skilled workforce through targeted education, apprenticeship schemes, and reskilling and upskilling programs, especially around industrial clusters. When we talk about a just energy transition, we talk about bringing in the workers who have that chemical expertise, that engineering expertise, who have, shifting from automotive to EV. This is going to be very important. Secondly, there is a huge opportunity through the domestic sourcing of responsible materials. By ensuring that the lithium used in UK battery manufacturing is sourced from domestic and responsibly managed operations, the UK can significantly reduce the ESG risks associated with responsible sourcing and supply chain transparency, which is obviously a big deal with the EU battery regulation coming into place in the next couple of years. Lastly, once again, the UK's strong research and development sector. We've got institutions like the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, the Faraday Institution, the Advanced Propulsion Centre, the Materials Processing Institute, and companies such as Agritas that are really pioneering next generation battery chemistries and technologies. That is just one more note that is a really important area to innovate in, and that's battery design. There's a lot of techno-economic assessments and sustainability reports that have demonstrated the changing aspects of pack, module, and cell design, and how they can simplify battery dismantling. We talk about that a little bit in the report, and I won't go into it too much here, but that's a very important and should be a targeted R&D issue.
Nice. So for the last stage, of course, this is end of life and recycling. A huge topic of interest, especially in the UK ecosystem. As I mentioned before, we have natural resources, but not in the volumes that China, Australia, Canada have. But the opportunity we do have is having industrial capabilities and infrastructure to recycle batteries and generating significant secondary streams of these materials that we need domestically. It's not as simple as that, though. Recycling is another chemically complex, energy-intensive process to do. Eileen mentioned designing batteries to be optimized. This is happening now with the end of life in mind, but that doesn't mean the ones that are produced and are in cars right now are. So actually breaking down batteries, getting the key materials out of them in a good state is very difficult to do. But thankfully, there's a lot of great innovation going on in the UK for this. Some of the risks here are very much related to the midstream again, and what's happening with the waste, what's happening with the chemicals, and how is this affecting the people that work it. But one thing I really wanted to point out as a risk here is recycling isn't an automatic silver bullet to make your production sustainable. It can be, but by heading into recycling processes which consume lots of fuel, aren't optimized, they're really inefficient, adding this on to your process at the end within a life cycle assessment lens can actually add more impact to your entire product. So the recycling process has to use green energy, it has to be efficient, and it has to be optimized to get as much material out of the batteries as possible. Then you start to see huge benefits for companies who incorporate this end of life at the end of their production process. But the big warning is that it's not a given. Recycling, just like battery manufacturing and upstream processes, has to be innovated on, has to be improved, has to be made sustainable as an isolated process by itself. And if not, there is implication for greenhouse gas emissions, just the same as all the other life cycle stages. It's not immune because it's recycling. It's great and it's amazing for resource use within the country and generating secondary waste streams, but it is not exempt from environmental impacts.
Thanks, Jordan. I'm aware that we're running a little bit over time. So the one UK opportunity that I really want to focus on is updating the waste codes to improve e-waste disposal and recovery. We strongly believe here at the CMA and among our members that the UK should work closely with industry and other stakeholders, as well as collaborate with its partners in the EU to update recycling regulations. The EU battery regulation, for example, takes a risk-based approach to regulation and outlines stringent controls on waste disposal of different battery chemistries, as well as enshrining disclosure requirements. The last report, actually, the autumn budget by the Treasury reaffirmed the government's commitment to move towards a zero waste economy and bring in over 1 billion per annum in revenue to improve recycling outcomes. And a couple of months ago as well, DEFRA announced the plan to ban single-use disposable vapes. So there has to be a national upscaling of how we recycle lithium-ion batteries, ensuring that these valuable materials are not squandered, they're kept in the UK and used as feedstock for projects and also R&D projects. And a key to this is making sure that we update the waste codes, which are outdated and don't account for some of the very complicated chemistries that are out there, disassembly and such. Great. So aware that we are slightly over time, so I'm going to try to run through these recommendations as quickly as possible. But essentially, if you take a look at our report, we have recommendations for each part of the supply chain. But at the end of the report, we also have a series of consolidated recommendations, which basically bring together key issues that we've seen reappear across the supply chain. Those are the horizontal policy levers that we talked about earlier. So the first key recommendation that we've identified is accelerating the greening of the grid and subsidizing energy. It's going to be very important for industry moving forward that energy is subsidized to maintain industrial competitiveness and incentivize business with things like tax breaks, for example, for on-site energy generation. This can really help the UK in its competitiveness. Also investing in grid infrastructure, so prioritizing the improvement and expansion of infrastructure to support increasing energy demands and renewable integration. And finally, continuing on the current path of diversifying and enhancing the grid's reliance on renewable energy to position UK companies as leaders in producing a responsible lithium product or a green lithium product, which will hopefully and has shown to attract investment from OEMs and private finance. Secondly, our second recommendation is improving UK legislation on waste management and planning and permitting. So as I talked about previously, updating the waste codes via comprehensive consultations to help redefine waste classifications and disposal methods to accommodate a lot of the new battery chemistries and technologies that are on the market and that are going to come onto the market too. We should also retain critical minerals domestically, ensuring that minerals in used batteries and e-waste are retained within the UK as feedstock rather than being exported. And we also need to work on streamlining and improving planning and permitting processes and their efficiency. This can be done by publishing shortened timelines, clearly defining agency roles in planning and permitting, encouraging cross-agency collaboration, consolidating standards, and resourcing local councils and regulators for faster processing. This is where ESG standards can really, really help local councils and regulators when evaluating projects for how feasible they are, how much benefit they're going to bring to a community, how environmentally sustainable they are, and the like. Thirdly, we've identified investing in skills and training for the green industrial workforce. So this was mentioned as well in the Fraser-Nash report, but regional skills growth is important, taking a regional approach to skills and training, committing to upskilling and reskilling initiatives in industrial clusters like Teesside and Humberside. One way is we can utilize the UK Shared Prosperity Fund for this purpose. There's been some successful initiatives such as Cornwall's Georesources Cluster, which has done some really great work in skills and training. Also supporting STEM education, specifically geoscience, chemistry, and engineering through, not just the national curriculum, but apprenticeships and specialized training for mineral planning and regulatory skills. Fourth is collaborating internationally to optimize trade and knowledge transfer, aligning on ESG standards, facilitating strategic partnerships to make sure we can secure strategic offtake and other agreements, promoting knowledge transfer, so encouraging collaboration between UK universities and also with global universities. There are we outline some of the great universities and the work they're doing here in the UK, such as the Camborne School of Mines, Durham, Imperial College London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Warwick. There's some great stuff happening here in the UK. And finally, our fifth recommendation is leveraging the UK's world-class innovation and R&D landscape. So identifying those high impact areas for R&D, which we've talked about a bit about today, innovation in battery design to facilitate material recovery, material substitution to mitigate demand pressures, closed loop systems for waste to enhance the circular economy. Encouraging multi-stakeholder collaboration, so industry and academia, but also with government and support services, and expanding public grant opportunities as well to attract co-indicative private investment. A great example is Innovate UK's Circular Critical Materials Supply Chains Programme, or CLIMATES for short, which had a showcase at Parliament a couple of weeks ago, showing a lot of the great projects that have been funded under CLIMATES, UK-based rare earth projects, which has resulted in over 200 million in co-indicative private investment, with only 15 million from government. So yeah, huge potential there for public-private partnership. Oh, this is just a very nice graph that shows just how much the UK leads in innovation. It's from a very interesting report by the Global Innovation Index, but it's why we feature it so heavily in the report, because it's really where the UK leads and there's a huge opportunity. So yeah, I think we've given as broad of an overview as we can. This doesn't substitute an actual reading of the report, which has a lot more detail, dives a lot into the specific projects that are available in the UK, provides some technical detail as well to some of the recommendations that we've provided. But thank you to everyone for coming along, and to those who have read the report. Thank you as well to our stakeholders who inputted into this report. We really consulted a lot of stakeholders and worked together with a lot of companies and our members to pull this together. So a huge shout out to them. The collaborative efforts of industry experts, academics, researchers, and support services are really needed to create impactful resources that effectively address the challenges and opportunities in critical mineral supply chains and are able to effectively inform policymakers when they're drafting important strategies such as the upcoming critical minerals strategy. So I want to invite everyone on the call to collaborate with us or give us feedback after they read the report. We are always open to collaboration. There's always more to learn. And also invite people to amplify this work. Hopefully it can help inform not just in the UK, but also in other countries that work with the UK. ESG standards are something that affects all of us, despite what certain politicians may say. I'm thankful that we do have some time left over for Q&A, and I know that there was some questions in the chat. So my colleague Gaia will now, I think, end the slides, the presentations, and we can unmute people if they do want to ask any questions. Jordan and I and Fiona are on the call to answer any questions that the best we can. Let me have a look. All right, I see one question from Andrew. Jordan, you mentioned that the mineral sector was lagging the construction sector in ESG. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm kind of looking at this from an LCA perspective. So within the construction sector, all kinds of products have what is called an EPD, an Environmental Product Declaration, which is a standardized way to communicate LCA results. And it's based on something called a product category rule, a PCR. Every single thing in construction has one, down to the specific types of cement, the types of steel. The guidelines have been set for years on how to do them. Within the raw material sector, only a handful exist, and a lot of them are outdated. They don't have modern mining applications, modern product implications. The battery regulations is an attempt to bring the raw materials aspects in the battery sector up to date with PEFCR, which again is just a PCR, product category rule. So that's really what I meant. Although life cycle assessment and different techniques are being used to look at product impacts for copper, aluminium, lithium, nickel, the rules are not set in stone, which makes it very hard to compare between studies. But in construction, this is all done, and EPDs are the language of communicating your environmental performance. It's all kind of established. We are working towards that, though. I know that the lithium PCR is being drafted now. There also exists two that Minviro helped draft, which is for graphite products and rare earth element products. So we're getting there. We're trying to kind of catch up, but mostly what I meant is that the landscape of how you communicate environmental product performances, construction have that covered, and we're a little bit behind in that sense.
No, thank you for that answer, Jordan. More in the measurement and reporting. I think it's a wider debate as to some of the proactive work that is being undertaken by the minerals sector to address its historic woeful performance. And that should be recognised. But I agree, if there's a lack of continuity in language that's not understandable, is not usable by consumers, then that doesn't help. And you've used a good reasoning behind your earlier statement. So thank you for that. Very helpful.
No problem.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. I see a question from Diana. How much of the total demand for this metal in the UK can these domestic lithium mining projects cover in the coming years? So this is a very difficult question to answer. I don't know if Jordan or Fiona have an answer for this, but I'll take a crack at it. It's firstly very difficult to quantify exactly what the supply and demand will be. You have stock and flow reports, obviously, that come out, but I would recommend actually that the Critical Mineral Intelligence Centre published a series of foresight studies earlier this year, lithium being one of them. And it does factor in, the scenario of what if we have these domestic lithium projects that come online. Obviously, it very much much depends on the production of those operations if they do come online in the next couple of years. We do know that with, you know, China's geoeconomic tactic of supply side dumping, sometimes these things are incredibly complicated. But I think there are a number of reports out there. I would recommend, I would point you to the report that CIMIC has done, because there's probably some useful insights in there. How can it capture the social impacts of lithium mining in the LCA, considering the complexity and variety of these impacts according to specific contexts? Jordan, I think you're best for this one.
Sure. So social life cycle assessment does exist as a thing. So what I've been talking about for most of today is environmental life cycle assessment, where you're measuring carbon footprint and things. SLCA exists. It's much less mature. It only recently, as in the last few months, got an ISO standard. And even then, the framework of how you actually conduct one is still kind of in development. We have been conducting some for the rare earth sector as part of a UK grant that we have, and the results were quite successful. So we compared China, Australia, and American rare earth production, and the social impact categories, I think there's like 40 something. So in environmental, you've got 16, there's 40 odd, and maybe possibly more in social. So it is complex, but I actually think it's quite useful as a starting point to see where the risk factors in the supply chain are. So if a particular part of your supply chain is really bad for human rights for workers, that will come out in the SLCA. If the country performs badly for Indigenous rights engagement, that will come out in the SLCA. It's nowhere near as granular and sort of well developed as environmental LCA, but it does exist. I'm very happy to, if you want to drop me an email, give you a bit more details. Again, not my work. I'm here talking about work of my colleagues, but a couple of my colleagues in my team have done a lot of work on SLCA. And yeah, the message is it's doable, it's informative, but it's quite immature as a technique.
Eileen, I just want to add to that, you know, LCA is a tool. It's a very useful tool for making comparisons at different levels, as Jordan has explained, but it doesn't take away from the ultimate need for companies to do detailed environmental and social impact assessments, human rights assessments, resettlement plans, all of these things that come when you're looking at, well, particularly upstream companies, but it affects all levels of organization. It's just the nuances that change. And it's the information that comes out of that that then feeds in to that LCA. So even if the LCA is still being developed, those background studies that are needed have to be done. And if people are interested, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, you may or may not have access to those publicly.
Thanks, Fiona. Next question is one from Andy at Altillium. An opportunity that is consistent throughout the life cycle is promotion of the circular economy and reusing or recycling waste materials. This, however, does not currently align with UK and EU legislative framework from the Waste Framework Directive. Defining end of waste within the UK in order to legally sell recycled products from waste, such as CAM from black mass, is an arduous process that prevents huge risks for businesses. Timelines to receive the definition of waste from the Environmental Agency can take up to 18 months. It would be good to hear opinions on this and how we can expedite this process for strategically important materials. I'll say a little bit on that before I can hand over to Jordan or Fiona if you guys have anything to say on that.
I'm not sure I've got any information on that.
Right.
Yeah.
No worries. Well, I think black mass, obviously, in and of itself is a very hot topic. Every time I go to any metal recycling or waste recycling or materials conferences, it does come up. I would say that the process to get this fixed, I mean, we've talked about the fact that we need to update the waste codes here in the UK, and there are concerted efforts across industry to make sure that regulations are improved, because, you know, there is a widespread recognition that legislation is outdated. The difficult thing with critical minerals, and we talk about this here at the association, is that critical minerals currently sits with the Department for Business and Trade, but it has, it has teeth in almost every single department across the UK government. It has applications for DEFRA, for the MOD, for the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, and for the Department of Education as well. Making sure that all these departments are aligned and they collaborate on critical mineral strategy is difficult, but it's going to be incredibly important moving forward, especially when we consider that secondary supply, the fact that the UK is a huge consumer market and a lot of the materials we're going to be getting will be from secondary supply. It's very important that we move on these issues. It's something that we talk about a lot in our circular economy working group and our domestic working groups. I wouldn't claim to have the answer for how we fix it exactly technically, but certainly it will require, significant multi-stakeholder effort, and perhaps definitely something to bring up at the next APPG meeting on critical minerals, which we'll make sure that that's included in the agenda.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, it's just one of those areas where I think potentially has been slightly overlooked, and within the waste industry, not always necessarily understood. You're presented with two options within the UK. You do a self-assessment, which the Environment Agency at any point can turn around and say, we don't agree with you, at which point you may have pumped millions into your business and you have to suspend operations because you can't legally sell your product as a product and be sold as a waste, but waste carriers and permitting and etc. can slow it down. Or you do this definition of waste service, which can take 18 months or if not longer, if it's complex. There are other things that can be done in the UK for things like aggregates or inert waste, compost, and other things. We've got waste action RAP protocols, waste resource action programs, I think they're called. Definition industry works with the Environment Agency. It says here are some standards, EU standards, UK standards on the quality of this product. We will recycle whatever it is to make this product to this standard, and that meets end of waste automatically, so you don't have to go down that process. But it costs, anecdotal evidence suggests it costs £30,000 to £40,000 to get this done. And if Altillium is sort of trailblazer or first to market, does this for CAM or MHP or PCAM and all the other things, yes, it's for the greater good, but we would have to foot that cost because industry does. So it's certainly something we need to work on as an industry, and getting the regulator involved in these calls is obviously a vital part of that, as you say, not siloing each other and including everybody across the board when it comes to the strategy.
Yeah,
it isn't helpful for this at all, but it's the same in the EU. So the battery regulations and the minimum recycled content regulations don't speak to each other. So people have set thresholds for recycling, but there's no kind of support about how to get there within the lens of the battery regulations, for example. It's very disparate, but people are realizing it, and there's a lot of conversations going on within the battery passport community and things about making them more cohesive. So I don't think it's an isolated problem that you're experiencing. People are aware that there's a bit of a disconnect. So not great. It's not help, but it's definitely being felt, and people are realizing it.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Well, I'm aware that we've hit 12:30. I know there were a couple more questions, but once again, just want to say that we welcome feedback. If you have any questions, let us know. I can pop my email down in the chat for any of those that read the report and have any questions or want to speak about anything else. On behalf of the ESG Working Group, thank you to everyone once again for coming along today. The report is live up on our website, and happy reading.